Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 711. After Edward's coronation ceremony, it was time to reward the heroes. Among them, the biggest hero was naturally Marin. Now, taking advantage of Edward's coronation ceremony, Marin's canonization ceremony was held at the same time. Marin von Hoffman. Edward said solemnly. I am here. Marin stood in front of Edward solemnly. He knew that the canonization ceremony had begun. And it was time for him to reap the rewards. In view of your great contribution to the war to eliminate rebellion in England, I decided to canonize you as the Earl of Northumberland, with the entire Northumberland County and the Isle of Wight. At the same time, I appoint you as the Commander-in-Chief of the Northern Border Garrison of England, responsible for guarding the northern border of England. Yes, my Majesty. Marin knelt on one knee in front of Edward. At the same time, he stroked the Bible and swore allegiance to Edward. But when he swore, Marin felt a little weak in his heart. Because he planned to get rid of Edward in a few years. If he swears to God now, will he be punished in the future? Although Marin was an atheist before, he even experienced the time travel, and now he is not sure whether God really exists. Of course, as a 10-year-old noble, the most important thing is to be thick-skinned. So, although Marin felt uneasy, he still completed the oath without changing his expression. Finally, Edward took out the king's sword and tapped Marin's shoulder, which was considered to have completed the oath of allegiance. However, Marin and Edward had another agreement before. Mainly, when Edward asked Marin to go north to attack the Scottish army, he promised him an Irish county. So, before Marin could stand up, he was to be canonized for the second time. In view of Marin von Hoffman's great contribution in resisting the invasion of the Scottish army and capturing King James IV of Scotland, I specially canonize him as the Earl of Wicklow in Ireland, and his fiefdom includes County Wicklow south of Dublin, and Port of Cork and nearby areas at the southern end of the island of Ireland. So, Marin continued to kneel, stroked the Bible again, and swore a second time. When the two oaths were completed, Marin's knees were numb. However, the process still had to be followed. Only after completing these procedures could Marin legally obtain these two earldoms. To be honest, Marin knelt on the ground and hated his numb knees, but the people around him were envious. That was the fiefdom of two counties. Generally speaking, only the older earldoms would have an entire county as a fiefdom. For example, the great nobles during the Norman invasion were basically given enough territory. But later, except for the king's son who had the power to actually seal a county, other great nobles were basically fictitious. For example, the Duke of Norfolk, just by hearing his reputation, you might think that the entire Norfolk county is his fiefdom. But in fact, the Duke of Norfolk's fiefdom is near Arundel Castle in Sussex County, which is far smaller than a county. This is still a duke. If it were an earl, the territory would probably be even smaller. For example, Edward's elder sister, Princess Margaret, as a close relative of the royal family, was named Countess of Salisbury. However, the territory only includes a small town, Salisbury, and the surrounding countryside. It can't be bigger. Only the king's own son can own an entire county. The nobles who have been canonized in recent years are all virtual titles, and the actual fiefdoms are not large. The earldom is generally just a small town and nearby manors, and the dukedom is bigger, but it is only the size of a few small towns. Only the old dukes and earls who have been inherited for hundreds of years have territories as big as a whole county. However, after decades of brutal War of the Roses, coupled with the war led by Edward and Marin, the traditional nobles in England were killed by two generations of kings, Henry VII and Edward. Therefore, Marin can now be regarded as the only noble who can obtain the entire county fiefdom. Moreover, it is the actual fiefdom of two counties, which is very enviable. Of course, seriously speaking, the military exploits that Marin has made for Edward are also completely worthy of his gains. You know, without the help of Marin, Edward would never have been able to beat Henry VII. What's more, while Marin was cleaning up Henry VII, he also destroyed the 10,000 Scottish army led by the King of Scotland, and captured James IV. This is basically equivalent to Marin alone, with his army, destroying two countries on the island of Great Britain. Such amazing military exploits, giving two counties is not a big deal. Moreover, Edward is not stupid. He not only gave two English counties, but also an Irish county. In fact, County Wicklow is the McMorrow dynasty established by the Irish natives before, which is a continuation of the kingdom of ancient Leinster. It is not a good thing to get this county, because this place has not yet completely returned to its heart. If you want to control it well, you have to suppress several waves of resistance first. However, fortunately, the population of Wicklow County is not large, and the combat effectiveness of the Irish natives is very poor. With the combat effectiveness of Marin's army, it should not be difficult to control there. After the big head of Marin is canonized, the rest are the small heads. French knight François also dared to come to London and participated in the coronation ceremony. He was canonized as the Earl of Calais by Edward, with the territory of Calais Fortress and trusteeship of the Channel Islands. In fact, this is equivalent to ceding the Calais Fortress and the Channel Islands to the French in disguise. After all, Knight François is a serious Frenchman who is loyal to Louis XII. But at least on the surface, England has not lost these two regions. Next, there is another wave of canonization rewards for military exploits. But what makes Edward depressed is that all those who were canonized were Marin's men, and none of them belonged to his own confidants. However, Edward also knew that this was inevitable. He was previously controlled by France, and later he mainly relied on Marin. Where would he have time to train his own people? The only trustworthy Sister Margaret died in front of the city slope, which made him depressed to death. So, now Edward doesn't have a confidant of his own. Fortunately, Marin is not an Englishman, and he will return to Germany sooner or later. Otherwise, he might really be sidelined by Marin. But based on the current situation, Edward must rely on Marin for a long time after he ascended the throne, and he can only rely on Marin. Otherwise, the blood debt owed by the thousands of nobles he cut off the day before yesterday alone would be enough for the remnants of the killed nobles to counterattack and kill him. In view of this, Edward could only pinch his nose and reward Marin's men. For example, Marin's deputy Schwartz was canonized as the Baron of Southampton. Southampton Port and the nearby manors are all Schwartz's fiefdoms. The reason why Schwartz was sealed here was also Marin's strong request. Before, Marin asked for the Isle of Wight as the home port of the escort fleet on the English Channel. However, the Isle of Wight is surrounded by oceans or straits, and there is no good freshwater port. In these days, in order to prevent the bottom of the ship from being corroded by sea maggots, sea vessels generally dock at ports near the mouth of freshwater rivers. Once a sea ship enters a freshwater port, the sea maggots will fall off the bottom of the ship and run away because they cannot adapt to the freshwater environment. Therefore, Southampton Bay, south of Southampton Port, is a more suitable port in this era. However, Marin had already chosen the Isle of Wight before, so it was not easy to choose more. And Schwartz and others happened to have made military achievements for Edward and needed rewards. So Marin simply asked Edward to seal the port of Southampton to Schwartz. The reason why Southampton Port was needed was that it was not only an excellent freshwater port, but also a city on the main island of England, so it was very convenient to obtain various supplies from the mainland. Unlike the Isle of Wight, which was isolated overseas, even the most common goods had to be transported from the mainland of England to the island by sea. Therefore, it was necessary to obtain the port of Southampton. In addition, Conn was also canonized as a baron because he served as a pioneer many times, broke through the enemy's formation, and made great military achievements. And Conn's fiefdom was also chosen in Portsmouth near Southampton. This is also an excellent harbor, but the freshwater port is small in area. In the era of wooden ships, the conditions are not as good as those of Southampton Bay. However, it is closer to the sea and has better location advantages. Seeing that Marin likes to be close to the sea so much, Edward simply canonized all the fiefdoms that Marin's soldiers should be rewarded on the opposite land of the Isle of Wight. In addition to Southampton and Portsmouth, Poole Harbour and Bournemouth, not far to the west of the Isle of Wight, were also canonized to Saqqara and Sivag, who made great contributions. They are called Baron Poole and Baron Bournemouth respectively. As for Marek, who captured James IV, he was also canonized as Baron Totten under the pseudonym of Tom Hanks. And Totten is right next to Southampton. In this way, Marin and his men almost control a large area of land on the main island of England opposite the Isle of Wight, and are fully qualified to build a large integrated port here to affect the English Channel. Of course, Southampton is not far from London. For the safety of London, Edward requires that the number of regular troops of Marin's men on the fiefdoms on the main island of England should not exceed 500. If civilian riots occur in the territory, London can send troops to help suppress them. In this way, Edward can also feel at ease. Marin agreed to it. Anyway, he never thought of violently seizing Edward's power. Why not use the marriage relationship between his son and little Margaret to gently control England? Anyway, he wants the Isle of Wight and asks his men to take Southampton, Portsmouth, Poole and Bournemouth, just to establish a stable naval base in the English Channel to protect the safety of his own fleet in the English Channel. So, it doesn't matter whether to station a large army on land or not. Chapter 7:12, Returning the people but not the ship. In order to reassure Edward, Marin even said that he was willing to return to Germany with all his troops as soon as possible. However, how could Edward dare to let Marin's troops go? He was now bloody and had countless enemies. As long as Marin's troops left, he might be hacked to death by his enemies. For this reason, Edward meant to let Marin leave the 4th Legion of Sakara and the 5th Legion of Sivag. The 4th and 5th Legions were all English, and they were naturally happy to be stationed in their homeland. Moreover, Edward also hoped to win over some confidence from these English soldiers. According to Edward's plan, the 4th Legion of Sakara was stationed in London to protect the city of London and him as the king. And Sivag led the 5th Legion to garrison Northumberland to guard against the Kingdom of Scotland. Of course, the treatment of the two legions was different. The 4th Legion was stationed in London to protect Edward. Therefore, Edward would bear all their expenses himself. And Northumberland, where Sivag was stationed, was now Marin's territory. Edward meant that the expenses of the 5th Legion would be borne by Marin himself. Nima, you want me to help you guard against the Scots, but you don't want to spend money, you are so stingy. Marin cursed in his heart, but on the surface he accepted Edward's opinion. However, according to Edward's idea, he would lead the army to conquer Scotland in a few years. By then, Northumberland would no longer be a border. Moreover, Edward now detained King James IV of Scotland and more than 10,000 prisoners of war and civilians. The Kingdom of Scotland has so few people, and there is no condition to organize a large army again. Therefore, it is not too dangerous to garrison the border in recent years. And a few years later, this side will not be considered a border. Seeing that Marin was so anxious to go back and seemed unwilling to stay in England for more, Edward began to feel very relieved. At least, Marin was not willing to be a powerful minister in England and set aside the king. In fact, Marin's attitude was just pretending. He did not think of being a powerful minister in England, but he thought that after a few years, when Edward appeased England, he would replace him. As for the way to kill Edward? Send a killer disguised as an enemy, there is no flaw. Edward had at least tens of thousands of enemies because of his killing of thousands of nobles the day before yesterday. It is estimated that no one would believe that he was killed by revenge. After persuading Marin to leave the 4th and 5th Legions, Edward's hanging heart was immediately put down. Next, it was time for him to appease other forces in the country. After the crisis of the French invasion, Edward deeply realized that England must have a strong navy. Otherwise, it would definitely not be able to deal with France, which already had a strong army. In fact, Henry VII did a better job in this regard. Although Henry VII did not form a standing fleet, he promoted some ship owners in the Five Ports Alliance. They were usually merchant ship owners, occasionally playing pirates and robbing French ships. In wartime, they all became commanders of warships. This mechanism made Henry VII have an incomparable advantage over the French even if he did not form a full-time large fleet. This time, Henry VII's naval warfare idea of hiding soldiers among the people to eliminate the French navy burst out with powerful energy, beating France, which was invincible on land, so that it could not take care of itself. If Count Valgery had not chosen to sacrifice himself at the last moment, thousands of French knights would have been buried in the sea. And the Kingdom of France would have been devastated. 4. The safety of England, Edward decided to maintain Henry VII's naval policy and win over those old shipowners. Of course, the target of the win cannot be the favored people in the era of Henry VII, but to win over those powerful shipowners who don't get along well with Henry VII. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, win over those who the predecessor doesn't like, this is the trick Marin taught him. Therefore, except for a small number of shipowners who belonged to sailors who resisted too fiercely in the attack and defense of London, Edward pardoned most of the shipowners and sailors. As for the big shipowners of the Five Ports Alliance who chose to let the old sailors deliberately go to sea to avoid the war, Edward also granted some of them the non-hereditary noble title of knight to further win them over. Edward's policy was indeed effective. When it was heard that Edward pardoned most of the shipowners and sailors and awarded honors to some big shipowners, the English maritime community suddenly settled down. Anyway, the whole family of Henry VII was beheaded. Even if they wanted to follow Henry VII's Tudor dynasty, they could only follow him in hell. It was not worth it. Therefore, most of the powerful people in the maritime world decisively chose to surrender to Edward. Only a few families chose to go to the port of Calais on the other side and surrender to France because they were unwilling to surrender to Edward. And Louis XII also cherished these English ship owners who came to surrender. Because now the French navy is finished, these people came to fill the gap. After Edward ascended the throne, he was called Edward VI. The coronation ceremony was also celebrated for 3 consecutive days. After 3 days, most of the guests left, but the French knight François. Oh no, it should be Count François who did not leave. He came to the palace and asked to see Edward. Your Majesty, now that the war is over, should we return the French captured soldiers and ships? Edward was stunned and suddenly remembered this. At the beginning, the English navy completely destroyed the French navy and captured a large number of French ships and supplies. At the same time, 5,000 French soldiers and 5,000 French civilians were captured in Hastings Harbor. So far, these people have not been returned to France. Because Henry VII originally planned to hit France hard. Damn, how should I deal with it? Edward patted his head and thought annoyed. So, he used the excuse that he needed to understand the situation first and sent Count François away first. Fortunately, the scheming Marin had not had time to leave. So, Marin was called into the palace again to save the emergency. Count Marin, what do you say, what should I do? Marin is now the Earl of England. In order to show his royal power, Edward directly called him Earl in private. Only in formal occasions will the other party be called Grand Duke. And this is also a reminder to Marin, you are my subject, help your wife find a way. Well. Marin thought for a while and said. Return all the captured French soldiers and militiamen, and there will be no ransom. But. Marin paused and said. All captured ships and sailors will not be returned. This, the French will be angry. Edward was obviously afraid of the powerful France. Your Majesty, whether you like it or not, France is England's enemy. There is nothing wrong with returning those infantry and militiamen to France. Anyway, France has always been a land power. But those warships and sailors are different. They are the only assets of the French navy. England has finally destroyed the French navy. If those ships and sailors are returned, all previous efforts will be in vain. Maybe one day the French will recover and invade England again. Edward thought about it and found that what Marin said was very right. So he nodded, but immediately asked. How should I respond to the French? Just say that those warships were distributed by Henry VII to the ship owners as rewards. As for the sailors, you can shirk your responsibilities and say you don't know. Maybe they were pushed into the sea by Henry VII's men to feed the fish. What if the French ask me for the baggage and supplies loaded on those ships? They were all spent by Henry VII in the war against you. They are gone. Okay, let's do it. So, Count François, who came excitedly to receive the troops and ships, only took back 5,000 soldiers and more than 10,000 captured French militiamen. As for ships and sailors, there was none. The same goes for supplies, which were said to have been consumed by Henry VII. François was very angry and ran to question Edward. But Edward, under the guidance of Marin, directly and shamelessly pushed all the blame to the dead ghost Henry VII. It was all the predecessor's fault, and I didn't know about it. In this way, Knight François had to take groups of prisoners of war and militiamen depressed, hired foreign ships in the port of London, and transported them back to the port of Calais in batches. Looking at the foreign merchant ships loaded with French prisoners of war and militiamen leaving the London docks, Edward on the wall of the Tower of London smiled bitterly. I bet that Louis XII must want to kill me. Isn't it true? Louis XII must be so angry that he wants to kill Edward after stealing all the ships, sailors, and baggage supplies from France. But Marin shrugged and said. Then he has to be able to cross the English Channel. France has almost no navy now. Is Louis XII going to cross the sea in a canoe? Ahaha. Edward laughed heartily when he heard Marin say this. And the fear in his heart was also dispelled. Yes, the French have no warships. Even if Louis XII wants to kill him, he must have a ship to cross the sea. Moreover, even if there is a ship, he has to ask the English navy whether to let them cross the sea. By the way, Your Majesty, why don't you take the opportunity to blackmail France? You know, so many prisoners of war and civilians can also be exchanged for a lot of ransom. Marin asked, puzzled. Do you think I don't want to? But France is a populous country, and it doesn't lack this population. If the captured people were the thousands of French knights, Louis XII might have sold everything he had to redeem them. As for these humble infantrymen and civilians, Louis XII probably wouldn't pay. Anyway, France doesn't lack people. Marin thought about it and it made sense. There were so many French people, and Louis XII might be willing to do something that he was unwilling to redeem. After all, those civilians were not considered human beings in the eyes of the nobles of this era. In addition, I need to be recognized by the Holy See. And there are many French bishops in the Holy See. If I release those French captives, at least I can shut up a lot of people. As for those ships and sailors, just like you said, just push them to the dead Henry VII. As for those infantry prisoners and civilians, there are too many of them, and they may not be able to exchange for ransom. It's better to pretend to be generous and return them to the French. In this way, a lot of food can be saved. Marin thought about it and was speechless. He still found it difficult to understand the thinking of the monarchs of this era. In Marin's heart, the life of every soldier and subject is precious. If they are captured, Marin will definitely find a way to either redeem them or snatch them back. The monarchs of this era only care about the lives of those nobles. As for the civilians, let them die. Especially in a populous country like France, a few infantry and civilians are simply not worth mentioning. If it were a small German prince, he might care about the number of civilians. But for France, which has a population of 15 million, 10,000 or 20,000 men are nothing at all. Since keeping them in his hands will consume a lot of food every day, and there is no ransom, it is really like Edward said, it is better to pretend to be generous and return them to France. Chapter 713, The Imperial Kitchen Problem. Edward was right. When the newly appointed Count François of Calais brought the captured infantry and militiamen back to the country, Louis XII asked with a frown on his face. Where are the ships? And the sailors? Count François had to repeat Edward's reasons. Louis XII was furious. Damn it, Edward is bullying me too much. 100 warships, hundreds of cargo ships, all dealt with by Henry VII. Even the sailors were dealt with. That's more than 10,000 sailors. Louis XII was so angry that he jumped up and down. In fact, Louis XII didn't really care about the 5,000 infantrymen and more than 10,000 militiamen. The core of the French army is the knights. As long as the knights are still there, they can recruit some militiamen and train them to form a new legion. And with so many people in the Kingdom of France, infantrymen and militiamen are the least valuable. In fact, these people can even consume England's food if they stay in England. Before, when Richard Pole was negotiating with France in Calais, Louis XII's representatives did not ask about the civilians and infantry, but only about the ships, especially warships, and those experienced sailors. Louis XII was willing to spend a lot of money to redeem the warships and sailors, and did not mention the civilians and infantry. But Henry VII was not a fool. He knew that if the warships and sailors were returned to France, France would have the ability to threaten England again. Therefore, Henry VII did not care about the ransom, but was unwilling to let the French redeem the warships and sailors, and even the cargo ships were unwilling to give, only the infantry and civilians. The two sides were deadlocked for a long time until Edward broke through London. Although Henry VII was beheaded and Richard Pole was also killed by Edward with poisoned wine, Edward also retained the principle of Henry VII before, that is, to curb the French maritime power. As long as Edward did not return the warships and sailors, then France would not have the slightest maritime power to threaten England. Just like now, Louis XII was so angry that he was jumping up and down, but he had no way to deal with England. Seeing that France had no way to deal with England, Edward began to think. Count Marin, what do you think, should I regret the engagement between little Margaret and Louis XII's son? Edward thought that since France had no way to deal with him, it would be better to break the engagement. Anyway, after this incident, England under Edward's leadership would not have a good relationship with France. Marin was immediately fed up. Damn, if you want to break the engagement with Louis XII, are you going to break the engagement with my son's second in line as well? This won't do. So, Marin said seriously. Your Majesty, a man cannot stand without trust, let alone the king of a country. Your Majesty is in his prime, and he will have many children in the future. Why should you break your promise for Princess Margaret's marriage? Moreover, we signed the Treaty of Nantes, and Louis XII has the text. If you openly break the contract, it will have a huge impact on your reputation. Anyway, I guess Louis XII is old and can't have a son. After so many years without a son, I don't believe he can still have a son. Edward nodded. He also felt that Louis XII was old and probably couldn't have a son. In fact, Louis XII was only in his 40s. If it were in the 21st century, this would be a man's prime. In a certain party, he would be considered a young cadre. However, in Europe in the early 16th century, he was an out-and-out old man. Because, in this era, the medical level in Europe was extremely poor, and it was full of mediocre doctors who bleed and crowed everywhere. In addition, after a man is over 40, his body's ability to resist disease is not as strong as it was in his 20s and 30s. In this era when illness is purely physical, a decline in physiological function means that it is easy to die if you get sick. Therefore, nobles who died in their 40s were very common in Europe at this time. And it is not wrong to say that Louis XII is old. Unlike later generations, even the definition of youth is set at 44 years old. What if Louis XII really gave birth to a son, and I only have Margaret as a daughter? Edward said worriedly. If Louis XII really gave birth to a son, it's not too late for you to regret it. Anyway, Princess Margaret is still young. Moreover, these few years are the critical period for your Majesty to consolidate his rule in England, so it's better not to make trouble. Openly breaking the contract will affect your Majesty's credibility. Even if you break the contract, you have to wait until you have complete control of England. Marin advised with a serious face, but what he thought in his heart was I knew you were not a good thing. When you completely control England, I will quietly get rid of you and take over England myself. Edward thought about it and felt that what Marin said was indeed very reasonable. He has just taken control of England and his rule is still very unstable. If he openly breaks the contract, it will indeed affect his reputation and may cause the people to distrust him. So Edward temporarily gave up the idea of breaking the contract. Just as the two were talking, a quarrel came from outside the palace. Edward frowned. Who dared to make a noise outside the palace at this time? You know, Edward just killed thousands of people 2 days ago, which can be said to be notorious. Unexpectedly, at this time, someone dared to provoke. Not long after, the guard who went out to inquire about the news came back, and he reported to Edward. Your Majesty, it's the French chef and attendant you left in Dublin before. They said that they came back to continue to follow Queen Anna. French chef. Edward frowned, a little hesitant in his heart. Because the dishes made by French chefs are indeed more delicious. You know, England has been known for its dark cuisine since the Middle Ages and is one of the countries with the worst diet in Europe. Anna's French chef was specially sent by Count d'Ette, and he also learned some techniques of making French cuisine from the Fat brothers, which really suited Edward's appetite. Therefore, Edward hesitated a little. After all, as a king, he didn't want to eat dark cuisine every day. Marin saw Edward's hesitation and quickly said, Your Majesty, you'd better not let them into the palace. Why? The dishes made by French chefs are really delicious. After saying that, Edward also revealed a nostalgic look. But, they are sent by Count d'Ette. Marin reminded. He didn't want to see Edward being poisoned by the French. The French now hate Edward so much that it is really possible that the chef will poison him. Count d'Ette is also my father-in-law. Edward said hesitantly. But as far as I know, Count Duarte is not only a favorite of Louis XII, but also an intelligence officer of Louis XII. Maybe, those cooks and French attendants are French spies arranged by Count Duarte. If they want to murder your Majesty. Edward suddenly remembered the last time he was kicked in the balls, and shuddered for no reason. In the end, Edward nodded and did not accept those people. So, Edward ordered his men to arrange those French cooks and attendants outside the palace and find a place to settle them. It's a pity, I can't eat French food anymore. Edward said with some regret. If your Majesty really wants to eat delicious food, why don't I recommend 1 or 2 cooks? I guarantee that their cooking skills are better than that French chef. Just like the braised pork that your Majesty ate last time, it was made by my military cooks. However, the cooking skills of those military cooks are actually very poor. The cooks in my palace are 100 times better. Really? Thinking of the delicious braised pork, Edward drooled a little. However, after thinking about it, Edward shook his head and said, "I'd better use Englishmen as cooks, it's safer." "Damn it, now you know to be cautious." "Just now I wanted to put French spies into the palace," Marin complained. But soon, Marin came up with a compromise. "How about I let my own royal chef come over and teach your majesty the royal chef you set, and then go back to the country?" Edward thought about it, and it seemed that this was indeed safe. So he nodded and said, "Okay, let's arrange it this way. I'm going to send people to ask among the people first, what famous chefs are there in London, so that I can recruit them into the palace to help me cook." Hearing this, Marin's eyes suddenly lit up. Because Marin remembered that he had let the North Sea Chamber of Commerce operate in London for many years, and it seemed that he had trained a lot of chefs. In addition to some chefs used by the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, Marin also developed downlines from the locals, opened some restaurants, and trained some chefs. If these chefs are given special training, let them stand out and enter Edward's palace. Then the source of intelligence will be stable in the future. The problem of royal chefs is a big problem. Edward obviously understood, so he would not want any of the cooks used by Henry VII before, lest he be poisoned to death. Therefore, Edward would definitely reselect the cooks. But cooks also need talent, so the best way is to select good cooks with clean backgrounds from the people. The North Sea Chamber of Commerce under Marin happened to have trained some cooks. Perhaps, we can take this opportunity to arrange them into the palace. You know, the royal chef is a very important position. With this position, you can know Edward's physical condition at any time. Poor health will lead to poor appetite, and at critical moments, you can also poison or something. Therefore, Marin decided to arrange the hidden spies of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce to bribe and other means to let the several dark cooks they trained stand out and enter Edward's palace as royal chefs. Edward would definitely not choose the royal chef himself, but send his men to inquire. Marin can completely let people spend money to create momentum so that the people Edward sent to inquire know the reputation of the cooks of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce. Then, they would ask someone to deliberately spread rumors and slander their competitors. If possible, they would bribe the officials who selected the imperial chefs. Finally, the spy chefs trained by the North Sea Chamber of Commerce would have a chance to enter Edward's palace. As long as they sneaked into Edward's palace, it would be much easier to gather intelligence in the future. Chapter 714, The Ship That Will Sink. After finishing the conversation with Edward, Marin immediately sent someone to secretly summon the person in charge of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce who was lurking in London, and ordered him to start arranging for the chef to sneak into Edward's palace. This time, after Marin helped Edward capture London, he only exposed a small number of people in the London branch of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, including the people who captured the West Gate and the crew of 10 merchant ships. Most of the others chose to continue lurking until Marin controlled England. After returning from Marin, the North Sea Chamber of Commerce representative who was responsible for lurking immediately arranged personnel to keep an eye on the officials sent by Edward to inquire about famous chefs. At the same time, he sent people to disguise themselves as civilians and deliberately praise the chefs trained by the North Sea Chamber of Commerce in front of the officials sent by Edward to inquire about famous chefs. Of course, he would also buy some idle hooligans to help make those chefs famous. At the same time, Marin also urgently sent real chefs to secretly train those chefs to improve their cooking skills. However, he did not teach them to cook any Chinese and French meals. Why? Because they should all be native chefs in England. Logically, it is impossible for them to know how to cook Chinese and French cuisine. Otherwise, it will definitely arouse Edward's suspicion. Therefore, they don't know Chinese and French cuisine, but in the dark cuisine world of England, becoming the best dark cuisine chef is the best choice. In fact, it is to incorporate a little bit of frying techniques to make dark cuisine less terrible, and strive to stand out from a group of dark cuisine chefs. Then, wait to be selected to be a royal chef in the palace. In fact, Marin originally planned to go back immediately. After all, it was September, and the autumn harvest was about to begin, and he had to return to the country to preside over the autumn harvest. But Edward had one more thing for him to do, so he kept him. What was it? It was about loading the children of Edward's cousins on a ship and sinking them into the sea. Before that, Marin gave Edward the idea of using glue to glue the boat to carry the children of Edward's cousins out to sea, and then breaking it apart in the English Channel to drown them. Then, Edward gave the task to Marin, and asked the shipyard under Marin to build this kind of ship. Fortunately, just when Marin was anxiously waiting, the beautiful ship finally arrived. In Hastings Port, Marin's shipbuilders, with shipbuilding materials and a lot of glue, came to a secretly built dock here. In fact, this group of shipbuilders had already experimented many times at the Emden shipyard and finally determined a plan for a laminated ship. After testing, the laminated ship they made would not have any accidents within half a day after going out to sea. Of course, in the middle of the English Channel with strong winds and waves, the accident rate is very high, and the disintegration rate is 100%. However, such a ship is impossible to sail to the UK. Therefore, the shipbuilders had to dismantle the ship, transport it to England, and then glue it back together. The husbands of Edward IV's 3 daughters, Princess Cecily of York, Princess Anne of York and Princess Catherine of York, followed Henry VII, or were all members of Henry VII's faction, otherwise Henry VII would not let them marry their sisters-in-law. Therefore, in the massacre, the husbands of the 3 princesses all died. And the 3 princesses were all sent to a convent, together with Princess Bridget of York, who had long become a nun. But the disposal of the children of the 3 princesses became a problem. After all, the 3 princesses were all from the York family, and their husbands did not directly participate in the Battle of Bosworth, which killed the king. Therefore, their children could not be implicated. However, strictly speaking, the children of the 3 princesses are all qualified to inherit the throne, and their order is very high. After all, the 3 princesses are all daughters of the former King Edward IV. If the current succession law did not recognize the Queen, the order of succession of these 3 princesses might be higher than Edward. In fact, the first Queen of England was Jane Grey. Although she was queen for only a few days and was executed by Mary I, she was indeed the first Queen of England. However, that was after the Protestant Reformation. It was still the Catholic era, and the English were not so open. Therefore, the daughters of Edward IV did not have a higher right of succession than Edward. However, if Edward died, the male descendants of their descendants would have a higher order of succession. Moreover, their children, especially the males, could easily be supported by Edward's opponents as hostile monarchs. Richard III and Henry VII were examples of being killed by hostile monarchs. With these 2 precedents, how could Edward tolerate the existence of the children of 3 cousins? But he couldn't directly order the execution. Therefore, letting them die, accidentally, was the best choice. A few days later, the glue of the glued boat was almost dry. So, Edward called several cousins and nieces over with a friendly face, gave them a lot of money, and allowed them to go into exile overseas and become a rich man. In fact, the children were very young, after all, their mother was not that old. I thought I would be killed by this cruel cousin, but being able to leave England alive was definitely a good ending. So, several children cheered. Soon, Edward sent someone to send several children to the dock of Hastings Port. Accompanying them were servants from the families of these children. However, in order to prevent accidents, Edward specially selected servants who had poor swimming ability or were simply useless to avoid these people saving the master at sea. On the dock, Edward deliberately placed several boats. But except for the boat glued together with glue, the other boats were deliberately arranged to be small and broken. Edward hypocritically let them choose for themselves, and the children of course chose the boat that looked new and good. Originally, Edward was going to arrange a few sailors for them. But among the children's servants, there were servants who knew how to operate the sails. In order to prevent the young masters from being safe at sea by the people arranged by Edward, these servants refused Edward's arrangement and volunteered to ask themselves to escort the young masters to France on the other side. After all, King Louis XII of France was unhappy with Edward, and he would definitely take good care of several young masters to disgust Edward. However, in fact, the best port to go to France is Dover. Because, opposite the port of Dover is the port of Calais. Moreover, the Channel of Calais is only a few dozen kilometers wide, and it is very convenient to cross. But Edward personally sent them to the port of Hastings, and they had no choice. However, crossing from the port of Hastings is nothing. At most, it will take a little more time. In the end, in Edward's meaningful eyes, the loyal servants moved the gold and silver treasures given by the young masters and Edward onto the beautiful ship made of glue, and began to set sail to France across the way. Alas, I don't want to. But, for the stability of the throne of England in the future. Edward shook his head and left the port. But before leaving, he asked Marin to send a ship to follow from a distance to see the effect. And Marin, of course, sent a small fishing boat to follow from a distance, and brought a telescope to observe whether the children were really drowned and whether anyone rescued them. If someone rescues him, we still have to find a way to hunt him down. Chapter 7:15, and wants to be queen. Things did not go as Marin and Edward expected. Half a day later, the ship reached the center of the English Channel. Finally, due to the beating of wind and waves, the glued parts fell off and fell apart. Then, the whole ship began to sink. For a while, desperate cries were heard on the ship. Several servants who could swim, carrying the young masters, swam hard towards the land. However, the ship was now dozens of kilometers away from the land, and the swimming level of several servants who could swim was not high, not to mention carrying children. In the end, under the gaze of the telescope of the scouts on the fishing boat sent by Marin, all the people on the boat were swallowed up by the vast sea. During this period, no other ship appeared and rescued them. "Your Majesty, it's done." After hearing the report from his men, Marin hurriedly reported to Edward. Edward breathed a sigh of relief. Now there is finally no competitor for the throne. After asking carefully, he learned that when the ship sank, there were no other witnesses nearby. In this way, this matter was done secretly. As for whether Marin, the executor, would reveal it, Edward was not worried. After all, Marin was also an accomplice in the murder of the members of the English royal family, and he was the main executor. As long as he was not stupid, he would never tell this matter. Otherwise, he would definitely become a rat crossing the street. From then on, Edward would pretend not to know the whereabouts of several cousins and nieces. After all, Edward sent those cousins and nieces on the ship in a friendly manner under the onlookers of many people. It's just a pity that those gold, silver and jewelry also sank into the sea. But this is also a good thing. Edward publicly asked people to move a large amount of jewelry on the ship, and many people saw it. If one day everyone found that the children were dead, Edward could completely shirk responsibility. Maybe someone killed them because of the money. You know, the boat was not specially arranged by Edward, but was chosen by several children in public. In fact, it was to use the psychology of children who like new and beautiful things to induce them to choose the plywood boat, and specially use several broken boats to set off. Many people can witness this, so it is hard to say that Edward deliberately damaged the ship. Moreover, there were no people arranged by Edward on the ship, all of them were servants from the children's families. Therefore, no matter how you look at it, Edward has enough reasons to pick himself out. After solving these major problems, Marin's mission was finally completed. So Marin said goodbye to Edward and said that he should go back. Marin has been in England with the army for several months. If he doesn't go back, his two sons may have forgotten him. In addition, his sister Anne seems to be getting married. Moreover, there is a very important piece of information from Poland. Alexander I, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, died on August 19. And the one who inherited the throne of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania was Prince Sigismund, Marin's prospective brother-in-law. In other words, when Anne marries, she will be the queen directly. Upon hearing the news, old Hoffman wrote a letter, strongly requesting Marin to return home as soon as possible, and to send a large number of troops to escort Anne to Krakow, the capital of Poland, when Anne got married in October. The newly crowned Sigismund I planned to hold the wedding in the capital of the Kingdom of Poland. Unlike Alexander I, who liked to stay in Vilnius, the capital of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Sigismund I preferred to stay in Poland. Because, in Poland, people call him His Majesty the King. In Lithuania, everyone calls him the Grand Duke. Marin didn't feel much about Anne becoming the Queen of Poland, but the old Hoffman couple were very excited. That's the Queen, the mother of a country. Therefore, old Hoffman and Lady Mary both asked Marin to return home quickly. In addition, at least several thousand elite troops should be sent to escort Anne to Poland. The reason for this is that the old Hoffman couple is worried that the Poles will look down on Anne's origin. After all, Anne's father was just an ordinary knight before. Therefore, both old Hoffman and Lady Mary hoped that Marin could send thousands of elite troops with good looks to escort Anne all the way to Krakow, to strengthen Anne's prestige and to calm down those Poles. Even in the eyes of old Hoffman and Lady Mary, the autumn harvest that was about to begin was not as important as this matter. Marin didn't know whether to laugh or cry after reading the family letter, but he did understand the ideas of old Hoffman and Lady Mary. After all, they were just native ancient European aborigines who respected the royal power very much. When they learned that their daughter might become the queen, the old couple were almost crazy with joy, and they almost revealed all the agricultural secrets to Sigismund I before. So it was normal to let him help cheer this time. It just so happened that Marin also planned to strengthen relations with Sigismund I. After all, a kingdom of Poland and a Grand Duchy of Lithuania are definitely powerful political allies. However, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania are both countries with strong aristocratic power, and the king cannot be arbitrary. Therefore, Sigismund I actually needs powerful allies to cheer up to calm down those nobles. Therefore, Marin planned to escort into Krakow, Poland with 10,000 troops to scare the Polish nobles. Not only for Anne, but also for Sigismund I. Only when Sigismund I's voice is strengthened, it will make sense to make friends with Poland and Lithuania. If it is a puppet, it will be meaningless. Of course, Sigismund I is not a mediocre person. History has proved that he is quite capable. After all, it was this man who bought the Crimean Khanate. Since the Crimean Khanate and the Grand Duchy of Moscow fell out, the situation in Poland and Lithuania has improved a lot, from being suppressed by the Russians to having a slight advantage. If it weren't for the large number of Russians, more centralized royal power, and more resources that could be mobilized, it might be a tragedy. But no matter how capable Sigismund I is, he has only been on the throne for a month and has not been able to control the overall situation. At this time, Marin's support for him through the wedding was definitely a great help to him. Therefore, before returning home, Marin wrote to Sigismund I, asking him if he needed to bring tens of thousands of troops to cheer. As a result, the other party replied quickly. When Marin just landed at Emden port with his army, Prince Sigismund's reply had been sent at full speed through Marin's newly built post-station system. Prince Sigismund very much welcomes Marin to bring 10,000 troops to the wedding, and even expressed his willingness to provide most of the food and grass for the army. Moreover, because Poland is a country where knights are respected and there are many knight nobles in the country, Prince Sigismund hopes that Marin will bring more plate armor knights to show off to those Polish nobles. In fact, both Marin and Sigismund I know very well that since the appearance of Marin's volley gun formation, the role of knights in war has been greatly reduced. However, the conservative and powerful nobles of the Kingdom of Poland just eat this. Showing them the knights' weapons can better intimidate them. But the problem is that Marin's knights are really few. Most of his soldiers are mountain people recruited from the southern German mountains. Marin has only more than 1,000 wandering knights from knight families, and he went to the Teutonic Kingdom to recruit them, and most of them were organized into lancers. And what kind of country is Poland? A country of lancers. In the war with Sweden, tens of thousands of winged cavalry were directly mobilized. More than 1,000 lancers were used for demonstration. Isn't that a show of skill in front of an expert? However, Marin was quick-witted and quickly thought of a solution. He remembered that he seemed to have 2,000 black shirt knights. Although these guys are light cavalry, they are also cavalry. Just then, a batch of zinc ingots were shipped back from America, and Marin decided to use galvanized tinplate to cut out a batch of lightweight horse armor and plate armor. In this way, the 2,000 black shirt knights could barely wear the glittering plate armor. Such a group of knights wearing shiny tinplate plate armor going to Poland might be very intimidating. Chapter 7:16, Prisoners of War to be released. After returning to Aurich, Marin had a warm time with his family, and the next day he went to the blacksmith shop to forge a fake plate armor. Under the surprised gaze of old Hoffman, Marin directed the blacksmiths to roll the thin iron sheet in the zinc liquid for a few times. Then, one sheet of tinplate after another came out of the oven. Then, it was time to forge the plate armor. But Marin's forging method was a bit strange. He didn't forge it with a hammer, but cut it with scissors. Marin directly found a large pair of scissors and started cutting the tinplate. After cutting, let the craftsman bind the cut tinplate with nails. For the breastplate part, an extra layer of tinplate was used to make it look more like plate armor. In this way, in just an hour, Marin brought a few craftsmen and made a set of silver-shining plate armor. Old Hoffman, who came to watch, was stunned, and my plate armor is still made in this way. Others use hammering, you use cutting. Make cloth robes. Moreover, the most ridiculous thing is that this set of plate armor looks really good. Marin specially called a few black knights and asked them to try it on. As a result, the black knights said that the full set of plate armor was about the same weight as the breastplate and helmet on them. However, it looks much better. That's good, the appearance is what we want. Marin nodded, and found more craftsmen to ask them to cut out 2,000 sets of plate armor as soon as possible so that they can catch up with N's wedding. As for horse armor, Marin didn't let it be made in the end. Because Marin actually planned to instill the concept of winged cavalry to Sigismund I, and his lancers did not wear armor on their horses. This way, it also looks more unified. In addition, in order to maintain the uniformity of the cavalry's armor, Marin also asked the 1,000 lancers to galvanize the plate armor. In this way, everyone is shiny and there is no longer much difference. As for outsiders, why is it shiny? Marin ordered everyone to unify their words. The surface of the plate armor is tinned. Tinplate is not a secret, and it is not Marin's original creation. In fact, craftsmen in Bohemia knew how to make tinplate as early as the 14th century to prevent rust. And many plate armors in the Kingdom of Bohemia are indeed tinned to better prevent rust. However, this kind of tin-plated plate armor is often expensive and belongs to fine products. Marin also felt that the three shiny guys were indeed too showy, so he ordered the cavalry to wear white-bottomed black cross vests like the infantry, covering the upper body breastplate and the lower body with skirt fabric to cover some, so as not to be too cool. You know, people in this era are stupid. If you see so many cavalrymen under Marin wearing silver white armor, you might think it is made of silver. The bold ones might come to the barracks to steal the silver armor. Another problem is the formation of the cavalry. Marin asked the black shirt knights to disguise as plate armor knights, and naturally they couldn't be exposed. Therefore, Marin planned to mix the lancers and the black shirt knights. 1,000 lancers were mainly arranged in the front and periphery, while the lancers wearing fake iron plate armor were mainly in the inner circle. In this way, it would be much more difficult for outsiders to identify them. While Marin was busy cutting fake plate armor and fooling the Polish nobles, the autumn harvest in East Frisia also quietly kicked off. Because of the large-scale use of potash fertilizers, the rye in East Frisia matured half a month earlier than in other areas. Therefore, in mid-September, the rye in East Frisia began to be harvested in autumn. In other areas of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea, only the provinces of Oldenburg and Schleswig, as well as the province of North Munster, had been under the control of Marin for a long time and also used potash fertilizers, so the autumn harvest was relatively synchronized with the province of East Frisia. As for the newly incorporated territories such as Bremen, West Frisia and Jutland, because the fertilizer field had not been built during the spring plowing, potash fertilizers were not used, and the autumn harvest had to wait until October. However, at this time, the electorate of Saxony and the electorate of Brandenburg, including Switzerland, sent envoys to ask Marin to return the tens of thousands of prisoners of war. Because the three regions are also about to harvest in autumn, and there is a lack of young and strong labor in the country. Moreover, the canal in the south of Munster has been dug almost, and it is estimated that it will be completed after the autumn harvest. Therefore, the three forces discussed with Marin, can they release people earlier? After all, the three countries also need labor for the autumn harvest. Of course, the only ones who need labor are the electorate of Saxony and the electorate of Brandenburg. As for Switzerland, it is purely for those mercenaries to go back and help fight against Emperor Maximilian I. After all, there are 18,000 mercenaries captured in Switzerland, all of whom are the main force. Today, the total number of troops in Switzerland that fight against the emperor's troops is only about 10,000. Facing Maximilian I's 20,000 troops, the emperor has increased his troops. Some can't resist. If these 18,000 captured Swiss mercenaries were released back to their country, the situation would be very different immediately. By then, the Swiss military will surge from about 10,000 to 28,000, which will form a huge advantage in military strength and combat effectiveness over the Austrian army. Even though the Marin phalanx used by Frundsberg, who is currently reused by Emperor Maximilian I, is more powerful, it is only comparable to the combat effectiveness of the Swiss mercenaries. If the Swiss have these 18,000 veterans return, they will definitely be able to repel the Austrian army and even recover many areas. Unlike now, the Swiss mercenaries have been compressed to only defend a few provinces in the west close to France. However, Marin is not happy to see the Swiss defeat the emperor. The victory of the Swiss is equivalent to the victory of France. If the emperor is defeated by the Swiss, it means that the French demon is more powerful. Today, the Swiss have not parted ways with France because of Marin's intrusion. The two are allies, and the strength of Switzerland is equivalent to the strength of France. For this reason, Marin will suppress Switzerland no matter what. What's more, Marin has always been afraid of the Calvinist Protestantism that will appear in Switzerland in the future, that is a violent sect that specializes in rebellion and killing kings. To this end, Marin planned to let Emperor Maximilian I defeat the Swiss and rule Switzerland. With the Habsburg family's piety to Catholicism, there would never be any Calvinism in Switzerland. In addition, even if the Habsburg family ruled Switzerland, they would not be able to live in peace. Because the Swiss people are fierce, they will definitely riot and revolt against the rule of the Habsburg family. In addition, France is next to them. Under their instigation, Switzerland will definitely revolt in the future, consuming a lot of the Habsburg family's energy. In short, eating Switzerland is not necessarily a good thing. Unless Maximilian I has the courage to massacre all 600,000 Swiss mountain people. But if you really do that, no matter who it is, you will be regarded as a devil by all Europeans. Since you plan to suppress Switzerland, Marin immediately sent people to Austria to inform Maximilian I am going to release Swiss mercenary prisoners of war, you should lead your troops and get ready. When releasing Swiss prisoners of war, they will definitely not be allowed to carry weapons. As long as Austria sent a large number of cavalry to ambush, it would definitely be able to capture these 18,000 unarmed Swiss prisoners of war. Anyway, Marin would release them at that time, which would be considered as fulfilling his promise. As for the Swiss being ambushed by the Austrians after leaving the territory of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea, it was none of his business. Chapter 717 The Era of Queuing and Shooting. With the return of Marin, the news from England gradually spread to the continent. Many monarchs on the European continent learned a shocking news: King Henry VII of England, who was once invincible and the only one in England, was defeated and killed by Edward of the York family, who escaped. Of course, the monarchs and princes on the European continent did not care much about who would live and die between Henry VII and Edward. At most, Edward killed thousands of nobles and their families at one time, which seemed too cruel. However, Edward's reason was also very sufficient: these people all participated in the Battle of Bosworth, which killed the king. In order to give the greatest punishment to all the regicides, the whole family of those people was killed. For Edward's statement, the European nobles felt that Edward was cruel, but they actually agreed with Edward's words. After all, they were also monarchs, and they were most afraid of their subordinates killing the king. Therefore, while they accused Edward of cruelty, they took out the example of Edward killing the whole family of the regicide, and educated their subordinates: look, this is the end of the regicide. However, for the nobles on the European continent, the army in this war is what they are most concerned about. Because the protagonist of this battle for the throne is not Edward, but Marin. Before, Marin led an army of 40,000 and defeated the 50,000 Bose coalition army with 20,000 Swiss mercenaries, which had already amazed the whole of Europe. Now, it is said that this guy brought 20,000 troops to England and directly dealt with Henry VII. The results of the war are really amazing. You know, Henry VII is not a good guy. He has ruled England for 30 years, and his rule is quite stable. He is one of the monarchs with the strongest control over the country in Europe. Moreover, the English longbowmen are famous all over the world. Back then, it took the French hundreds of years to slowly turn the tide and win. You know, the French had many plate knights and deployed hundreds of cannons on the battlefield before they defeated the English longbowmen with difficulty. Marin, on the other hand, only brought 20,000 people across the sea, and after dealing with Henry VII's English army, the losses were very light. Although Edward had the help of the French army in the early stage, many people knew that the French recalled 7,000 French troops after being beaten badly by Henry VII in the English Channel. Therefore, the defeat of Henry VII was independently accomplished by Marin's army. As a result, Marin's fame once again made it to the hot search list in the European aristocratic circle, becoming an important topic of conversation for the nobles after dinner. Now, many monarchs and princes in Europe are discussing one thing: what makes Marin's army so powerful? Everyone has different opinions, and even many nobles will quarrel on the spot. But the European nobles of this era have not yet accepted science, and their thoughts are still relatively conservative. After all, the influence of the Holy See is still so great. In addition, the nobles have a kind of arrogance, which leads to the fact that those great nobles are unwilling to admit that Marin, who came from a small knight family, is more capable than them. So, after fierce debate, everyone finally reached a point of view that everyone recognized Marin's army is well equipped. As for Marin's command ability, it was deliberately ignored by these great nobles. Where is Marin's army equipped well? Everyone still knows this. Everyone knows about the previous battle with the Bossa coalition. The first 3 rows of soldiers in Marin's army all wore breastplate armor, which had high defensive capabilities. You know, it seems that only Swiss mercenaries, whose salary is 3 times that of other mercenaries, can wear breastplate armor in the first 3 rows of infantry. In traditional armies, only noble knights are qualified to wear it and have the financial resources to afford the cost of buying plate armor. And those infantrymen, in the eyes of the great nobles, are basically cannon fodder roles, and there is no need to equip them with plate armor, even a breastplate. Marin did the opposite and equipped the infantry with breastplate armor and helmets in large quantities. This puzzled the great nobles. Of course, Marin didn't have many knights, so he could only rely on infantry. Therefore, it was reasonable for Marin to pay attention to the improvement of infantry. Therefore, the high rate of plate armor equipment is an important conclusion drawn by those great nobles, and they believe that this is an important reason for Marin's repeated victories. This is only one of the reasons. In addition, the monarchs and nobles of European countries believe that the strong combat effectiveness of Marin's army is inseparable from the large amount of equipment of muskets. Because the many battles in recent years, especially the several wars fought by Marin, and the wars for hegemony between Spain and France and Italy, have fully proved that muskets are very restrained against knights. Before Marin used the muskets from Spain on a large scale and created the world-famous Marin phalanx, the plate armor knights were a strategic force with decisive power on the European battlefield. Although the Swiss policy also defeated the Burgundian knights, it was because the Burgundian knights were not familiar with the Swiss battle formations that they were defeated. Before this, the monarchs and nobles of Europe always believed that the plate armor knights were extremely important armed forces. However, the emergence of Marin, and the fact that he first equipped the army with muskets on a large scale, broke the myth of the knight's invincibility. Marin's Marin phalanx could not only withstand the knight's charge, but also kill a large number of plate knights, which was simply a nightmare for the plate knights. If Marin's previous battles could not prove this point, after all, Marin liked to launch sneak attacks, especially night attacks, then the Spanish used the muskets and the Marin phalanx to defeat tens of thousands of French knights head-on, which fully proved one point: the large-scale use of muskets made the knight's strategic position extremely challenged. Even the monarchs and nobles of various countries knew one thing, that is, after the disastrous defeat in Italy, France began to consider equipping its troops with muskets. After the Battle of Lubeck, because of the failure of the Swiss mercenaries, King Louis XII of France made up his mind and finally formed the first batch of French musket troops. As a result, most of the monarchs and princes in Europe believed that the musket was indeed a big killer, probably. It was also the biggest secret of Marin, a boy of humble origin, to win battles again and again. Especially, when the news came from England that Marin's 20,000 troops easily destroyed the English army with thousands of longbow soldiers without too many casualties, the monarchs and princes on the European continent became more interested in muskets. As kings and princes whose origins were much nobler than Marin, they would never admit that their abilities were lower than Marin. After all, their own bloodline was so noble, and Marin's bloodline was so lowly. Admitting that they were not capable was something that these monarchs and nobles in Europe were absolutely unwilling to do. However, they couldn't ignore Marin's success on the battlefield. So, it eventually led to the emergence of a phenomenon: the musket became popular in Europe. Even Marin Hoffman, a boy of humble origin, can rely on large-scale equipment of muskets to win battles again and again. I don't believe that my army will lose to others if it is equipped with muskets. This is the idea of many monarchs and nobles in Europe. So, for a time, those craftsmen in Europe who can make muskets suddenly changed from inconspicuous characters to hot figures. Many monarchs and princes of European countries, as long as they have their own armies, began to recruit those craftsmen who can make muskets and treat them as guests. Although they cannot be treated as nobles, they can also be treated with the highest treatment and courtesy to civilians. As a result, musket craftsmen suddenly became the most popular profession in Europe, and were favored by monarchs and princes of various countries. The consequence of this is that the armies of various European countries have introduced musketeers one after another, and they were introduced in an organized manner. At least, when fighting, 3 rows of musketeers can still be put together, just 3 sections of shooting. When Marin heard the news, he had a headache. Damn, the future battles will be cruel. Obviously, facing volleys, it is unrealistic to have no casualties or low casualties. A few dozen grams of lead bullets hit, either dead or injured. Moreover, gunshot wounds are very difficult to heal. You know, even in the 19th century, during the American Civil War, soldiers who were shot in the limbs often faced the tragic fate of being amputated by doctors. In his previous life, Marin often saw such movies. A soldier was injured by a lead bullet, and then the doctor pushed him onto the operating table, not for surgery, but for leg sawing, very bloody, very brutal, often with blood everywhere. And the gunshot wounds caused by lead bullets cannot be completely solved even by the alcohol and gauze promoted by Marin. Alcohol and gauze can only make the soldiers injured by cold weapons recover as much as possible. But facing the gunshot wounds caused by dozens of grams of lead bullets, it seems that only a magic medicine like penicillin can deal with it, because dozens of grams of lead bullets can not only cause huge trauma to the human body, but also have toxicity. In addition, there are many bacteria on dozens of grams of lead bullets. After the lead bullet is shot in, it rolls a few times in the human body, and it is difficult to clean the wound with alcohol, unless that part of the meat is cut off. But the damage caused by lead bullets is generally large, and if all the meat is cut off, the person will not survive. Therefore, people who are injured by lead bullets will inevitably be infected, and accompanied by lead poisoning, which is extremely difficult. Just like the army that fought against Marin before, most of the people who were shot by Marin's musketeers did not survive. It's not that they were shot dead on the spot, but most of those who were shot died from wound inflammation and lead poisoning later, and many people did not survive even after their legs were amputated, which was quite miserable. It seems that it's time to develop the miracle drug penicillin. Otherwise, the soldiers will have to have their legs amputated after being shot in the future. Marin sighed. He knew that the era of European queues for execution was coming. Chapter 7:18 You line up to be shot, and I will execute you with a cannon. The war of line shooting is extremely cruel. The armies of both sides not only compete in combat skills, but also in courage and fearlessness. In this era, Europeans are not so brave. You know, once those nobles and knights encounter difficulties, they will choose to surrender and wait for themselves to be redeemed. However, in the era of line shooting, bullets have no eyes. Those lead bullets flying around on the battlefield don't care whether you are a noble or a civilian. Once caught, you will either die or be injured. Moreover, lead bullet injuries are extremely difficult to treat. Even if you are cured, there is a high possibility that your arms or legs will be sawed off. If the army still fights in the way it is now, many old-school noble officers will probably be killed or injured by flying bullets before they have time to surrender. And if the discipline of the soldiers in the army is not good and their willpower is not strong enough, once the commander is shot, the army will easily collapse. Moreover, even modern armies with very strict discipline are prone to accidents when fighting a war of line shooting. Of course, for those veterans who ignore death, this is nothing. But for those who had just joined the battlefield, being lined up and shot was a little too cruel. On the battlefield of being lined up and shot, because the accuracy of the smoothbore rifle was touching, the soldiers standing in the front row were all gambling their lives, gambling that the opponent's bullets would not hit them. This way of gambling with life was okay for veterans, but for new recruits, the mental pressure was too great. Therefore, in later wars, veterans often stood in the front row. Otherwise, the new recruits would be frightened and easily collapse and run away, and then they would not be able to fight. Some people may say, that's easy, you learn from the British lobster soldiers, shoot at close range at 30 yards, and then launch a bayonet charge. If anyone thinks so, Marin, who has fought many battles, will definitely spray in front of him, you sabi. Why do you say that? Because this is determined by the background of the times. The British lobster soldiers' close volley plus charge tactics were in the 18th century, which was in line with the social background at the time. Why? Because at that time, the army was equipped with muskets. After the bayonet was installed, everyone's weapon length was about the same. When fighting, whoever is brave wins. But what about this era? This is the early 16th century. You know, the plate armor knights have not been completely swept into the garbage dump by the muskets. At this time, if you let the musketeers put on bayonets and charge, it is absolutely a waste of life. Facing the musketeers who put on bayonets and charge, there are not many. The opponent only needs to send a few hundred plate armor knights to tear open the musketeers' charge formation and then slaughter them. Without lead bullets, the musketeers with bayonets are no different from chickens to be slaughtered when facing the plate armor knights who are not afraid of swords. Not only that, the musketeers with bayonets and the spearmen on the opposite side holding several meters long spears are also looking for death. Their spears are several meters long, and your rifles with bayonets are only more than 1 meter long. The Swiss spearmen's spears are several meters long. You are a musketeer, and your musket with bayonet is only about 1 meter and 60 to 70 centimeters long. You rushed forward with a bayonet, and you were still several meters away from the enemy, but you were stabbed to death by a spear. There was no way, the length was not enough, you could not reach the enemy, but the enemy had already stabbed you. Let's make an inappropriate analogy. Yao Ming and Pan Changjiang are fighting. Yao Ming doesn't need to do anything, just stretch out his arms and hold Pan Changjiang. With the length of old Pan's arms and legs, he can only jump up and down there, but he can't hit Yao Ming. After all, Yao Ming's arms are too long. As long as he holds Uncle Pan can't reach Yao Ming's body with either his arms or legs. So, the bayonet is by no means a magical weapon, it depends on what era, what weapon the opponent uses. Someone may say, oh, it seems that the British army defeated the defenders of Zhenjiang with bayonets in the Crow War. But you have to know that the weapons of the army guarding Zhenjiang are mostly not long weapons. The weapons used by the banner soldiers in Zhenjiang are a considerable proportion of bird guns, matchlock guns handed down from the Ming dynasty, and they have not yet been equipped with bayonets. Another thing is the waist knife used by the banner soldiers. This thing is definitely shorter than the musket with a bayonet. If you are not a person with strong martial arts, such as the 29th Army's broadsword team, you will definitely not be able to get away with someone holding a bayonet. The spear can still fight against the British bayonet. But those who use spears in the Qing army are definitely low-ranking soldiers, and their combat effectiveness and fighting will are the worst. Those with a little status will definitely have a waist knife with a sheath and some martial arts. And the spearmen are generally cannon fodder soldiers. Even those uncles who use waist knives and muskets have been defeated. Do those who use spears still have the will to fight? Moreover, there are more than 1,500 banner soldiers guarding Zhenjiang and not running away. Since they are masters, they will definitely not use cheap weapons like spears like miscellaneous soldiers. Getting a good waist knife and riding a Mongolian horse is their standard. Only those who are in a very bad situation will use spears, a weapon for cannon fodder soldiers. Those who are not so good at fighting use bird guns and no bayonets. Therefore, the British army dared to launch a bayonet charge against the defenders of Zhenjiang. In addition to the advantage in numbers, it was bullying the opponent's short weapons. If you encounter Swiss spearmen holding several meter-long spears, Nimad will launch a bayonet charge. Musketeers have no armor, facing spears, they will be stabbed accurately. Therefore, Marin will not use bayonets to fight against those enemy armies with a large number of musketeers. Because, in this era, musketeers are a minority, and the mainstream is definitely spearmen and plate armor knights. Facing these two arms, musketeers with bayonets will definitely be abused if they rush up. Instead of doing this, it is better to stand and place a few more rows of guns. With the advantage of the number of musketeers in Marin's army, the opponent's musketeers can still be suppressed by shooting. In addition, Marin's army now uses clockwork musketeers instead of matchlocks. In this way, the musketeers do not need to be separated by 1 mil, and there is no need to worry about the gunpowder being ignited by the matchlock of the people around them. But other countries are different. They currently do not have the technology to use clockwork musketeers and can only use matchlock guns. In this way, Marin's musketeers can achieve a density of musketeers that is twice as high as that of their opponents. The density of firepower is naturally twice as high. When shooting at each other, they must have an advantage. Of course, Napoleon's experience tells Marin that artillery is the king against the musketeers on the opposite side. Especially when facing a dense row of musketeers standing in rows on the opposite side, an iron ball can take away a line of musketeers. Don't be too happy. The only problem is that if a large number of artillery is used, the gunpowder consumption is a bit high. You know, a musket shoots once and consumes only about 10 grams of gunpowder. As for artillery fire, if a 6-pound cannon is used, according to the ratio of 1 to 3 between gunpowder and shells, 2 pounds of gunpowder is needed for one charge. This can fire 90 shots. If hundreds of cannons are lined up and fired at the same time. Oh my God, there is not enough gunpowder. Unless there is a stable source of a large amount of gunpowder. So, let's go to Chile to find saltpeter. Once there is a large and stable supply of Chilean saltpeter, Marin can use cannons unscrupulously to take down the opponent's musketeers. Your muskets will hit the enemy at 100 meters, but my cannons can still aim at hundreds of meters, and one shot can take away a line. You line up to be shot, and I will execute you with cannons. Come on, let's hurt each other. Let's see who is more ruthless. Chapter 719, Expensive Dowry. Whether it is queuing up to be shot or cannonballed, that is not the most important thing. Right now, the most important thing for Marin is to prepare a generous dowry for Anne. Yes, a generous dowry. Because she is going to be the queen, and Anne is the princess of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea, so this dowry must not be shabby. Not only can it not be shabby, but it must be extremely rich. Otherwise, it is a disgrace. A queen with little dowry will be despised by her subjects. When the King of Denmark married his daughter Princess Margaret to King James III of Scotland, because he could not come up with a generous dowry, he actually gave the Shetland Islands, which originally belonged to the Kingdom of Norway, as a dowry to the Kingdom of Scotland. It can be seen that marrying a princess is also very costly. After all, the Hoffman family is a nouveau riche family that rose later, and is called a princess, but she is actually just the daughter of a poor knight. Now that the Hoffman family has developed, it is natural to decorate the facade. Therefore, the Hoffman family had to pay more dowry than ordinary vassal states when marrying their daughters, otherwise they would be despised. Old Hoffman naturally couldn't afford the dowry, so he naturally put the burden of preparing the future queen's dowry on Marin. Nima, marrying a sister is so expensive. If it were in China in the 21st century, it would be a great gift for your daughter to marry you. What do you dare to ask for a dowry? Marin said he was also very depressed. However, he had to abide by such rules. Otherwise, it would be a shame for the family. In desperation, Marin had to do everything possible to prepare the dowry. After careful consideration, Marin believed that the dowry was mainly used to show off the strength of the mother's family. Therefore, it must be high-end and classy. When it is shown, it must blind the eyes of the onlookers. Therefore, Marin's decision is to raise the most visually impactful materials as props to blind the eyes of the Polish nobles. First of all, silk is a must. Therefore, the first thing Marin prepared was a large amount of silk for making silk clothes. There is no silk produced in the Ming Empire now, so now we can only buy a large amount of European silk produced in Lyon, France. But, Nimad, the local silk in Europe is so expensive now, and a piece of silk clothing is calculated by gold coins. A cart of silk, Nima actually wants 5,000 gold coins. However, in order to support the facade, I bought it. Moreover, I bought 3 carts at a time. Seeing that 15,000 gold coins were spent so easily, Marin was so distressed. Nimad, in the contemporary Ming dynasty, a load of raw silk was only about 50 taels of silver. Even if a car was loaded with 10 loads of raw silk, it would only be about 500 taels of silver, equivalent to 436 gold coins. And Nimad, the quality of French lion silk is not very good, but he dared to ask for 5,000 gold coins a car, which is more than 10 times the price of Ming dynasty silk. Although the price of finished silk is higher, it is not so outrageous, right? No wonder the silk trade in the Ming dynasty was so prosperous later. It turned out that the French silk was too expensive and of poor quality. Next, of course, we need to prepare some daily utensils. For example, gold bowls and gold plates for eating. She will be the queen, and she will definitely use them in the future. Originally, Marin didn't have any luxury goods such as gold bowls and gold plates. Marin only likes silver tableware, because silver can be used to test poison. But Anne is going to be the queen, and old Hoffman and Lady Mary agree that she should be given a dowry of gold tableware. Fortunately, when Marin was sent to Britain, he led his troops to rob several noble houses in London. Therefore, he collected a lot of gold tableware. In addition, Marin also ordered several sets of gold chopsticks and knives and forks to be made for Anne. Chopsticks are naturally prepared for Anne, because Anne has been used to eating Chinese food over the years and can use chopsticks very skillfully. However, Sigismund I certainly can't use chopsticks. Therefore, Marin ordered knives and forks that were popular in Europe in later generations. They were made of gold, and the forks had 4 prongs, unlike the 2-pronged forks of today. Of course, it is easier to use a 4-pronged fork to pick up food. So, gold knives and forks, dinner plates, and wine glasses. In addition, there were a bunch of silver utensils, and some exquisite copper basins and other utensils. A large cart was loaded with all kinds of things. Fortunately, there were many silver and copper utensils, otherwise the cost of this cart would be amazing. These are the big heads and the most expensive parts. The rest are not so expensive. However, they are not cheap either. In order to increase the quantity, Marin also got a few large carts of woolen fabrics to make up the number. However, these are not used to make clothes, but carpets. In addition, there are some woolen coats and quilts to keep warm in winter. In addition, Marin also ordered the tailor to process the beaver skins that Garland bought from Newfoundland, and made several sea fur coats for Anne to keep warm in winter. Then there were some bottles and jars, of course, they were all fine products made of stained glass produced in Venice. As for porcelain, Marin didn't have any. After all, the Ming dynasty route had not yet been opened, and porcelain was a rare thing in Europe. Marin, an aristocratic upstart with no background, had no porcelain collection. Coincidentally, the Granada ship just returned home with a large amount of black sugar. So Marin simply had someone pack a lot of black sugar in oil paper bags and load 3 carts as a dowry. If in later generations, sugar cane was used as a dowry, it would probably be sprayed to death. Nima, such a thing can also be put on the table. Even in the contemporary Ming dynasty, sugar cane was an ordinary commodity that could not be put on the table. But this is in Europe. Sugar cane here is still a rare thing. The price of each pound of sugar cane is in shillings, not pfennigs. Therefore, 3 carts of black sugar are definitely high-end things. Moreover, although the 3 carts of sugar cane are more than 3 tons, it is nothing to Marin. Because the sugarcane production in Granada is very large now. With the help of fertilizers, the yield of sugarcane per acre is more than 1 ton, and can even reach 2 tons per acre. At a sugar yield rate of 15%, there are also 100 or 200 pounds of sugarcane. More than 3 tons of sugarcane is only the output of 30 or 40 acres of sugarcane fields. Of course, this is nothing to Marin. But for Europe, which is short of desserts, 3 carts of sugarcane are definitely a big deal. Since even sugarcane is used, Marin doesn't care about shame. So he loaded 3 carts of paper produced by the Cape Breton Island paper mill as a dowry. It's called, convenient for cultural dissemination. However, because of the confidentiality of papermaking technology, and doesn't know how low the production cost of the Cape Breton Island paper mill is. Although she knows that it is definitely lower than other paper mills, and can't imagine the difference of dozens of times. And doesn't know, so other people in Europe don't know. In those days, because of the extremely backward papermaking technology, Europeans still used hemp paper made of rags, fishing nets, hemp skin, etc., and the price was very expensive. Therefore, in the eyes of outsiders, 3 carts of paper were absolutely sincere. Then, Marin thought of the habit of Eastern Europeans to drink strong liquor. So, several carts of whiskey, rye ergotu, were also ready. Next, it was the important material that Marin's men were not short of salt. No need to say, load a few carts first. In addition, there are spices, which are currently a necessity for European nobles. It happened that Marin's warehouse still had the remaining part of the 50,000-pound quota shipped back from India last time, which was also loaded with 3 carts, weighing about 5,000 or 6,000 pounds. According to the European market price, it must be very expensive. But in India, the purchase price of these spices does not exceed 2 pfennigs per pound. Finally, there were some sundries, including a lot of exquisite wooden furniture, and various supplies. In the end, Marin put together 50 carts of dowry, which looked very large. Moreover, if we ignore the actual cost of sugar, paper, whiskey and salt, but look at the European market price, this batch of dowry is simply very valuable. Taking it out, it is definitely a symbol of the rich. Looking at the 50 carts full of dowry, Marin swallowed his saliva and said bitterly, "Damn it, I must have more sons and fewer daughters in the future. Otherwise, the dowry alone will make me bankrupt." Chapter 720 Poland is the best ally. In fact, what Marin said was a bit exaggerated. The most valuable of the 50 carts of dowry he prepared this time were actually the 3 carts of silk and the cart of gold and silver utensils. The total value of the 4 carts is estimated to be more than 30,000 gold coins. Then, the most expensive thing on the surface is probably the 3 carts of spices. Spices in Europe are now very expensive, with a market price of 10 shillings per pound, which is 2 gold coins per pound. Speaking of which, the market price of 3 carts of spices is estimated to be around 12,000 gold coins. Of course, this is the market price. But considering that Marin's men bought it in India at a price of less than 2 pfennigs per pound, 5 or 6,000 pounds of spices, the cost is only about 200 gold coins. Well, it's really frugal to give spices as a dowry, and it's also very face-saving. Marin now only hates that there weren't too many spices left before, and only 3 carts were left. As for sugar, paper, salt, and spirits and whiskey, they are all very high-end in the eyes of outsiders. But in Marin's case, it's actually nothing. Finally, after Kohler's estimation, the cost of these 50 carts is about more than 50,000 gold coins. However, the market price is as high as more than 200,000 gold coins. There is no way, this is the cost gap. Marin has mastered advanced science and technology and exclusive trade channels, and can obtain some expensive materials at low cost. Therefore, although the cost is only more than 50,000 gold coins, in the eyes of outsiders Marin prepared a dowry of more than 200,000 gold coins for his sister, which is simply too rich. What is the concept of 200,000 gold coins? There are probably only a few major countries in Europe whose annual fiscal revenue can be higher than this value. In the German region, the annual income of most princes does not reach 200,000 gold coins. Therefore, from the market value point of view, the dowry prepared by Marin this time is too rich. And then married to Poland, which is also very face-saving. What, you didn't calculate it wrong. So many expensive materials cost only more than 50,000 gold coins. Old Hoffman and Mrs. Mary were also a little stunned. The two elders were not very clear about Marin's business situation in the American colonies. After all, Marin only regarded them as noble mascots, but did not tell them about the specific matters. Old Hoffman was a poor student, and he would not understand even if he was told. As for Lady Mary, she was indifferent and had no interest in finding out about these things. Therefore, they were not very clear about the costs of sugar, paper and whiskey. They only knew a lot about the costs of salt and spices. Seeing the dowry of the 50 carts, Lady Mary estimated that the market value was as high as more than 200,000 gold coins. At this time, the old Hoffman couple also felt embarrassed. It was not reasonable to let their son prepare a dowry for their daughter. Unexpectedly, their son was so bloody. They couldn't let their son go bankrupt for their daughter. So, the two elders came over and wondered whether Marin should reduce the cost. But Marin didn't care much. After all, he not only made a lot of money from confiscating the homes of those great nobles in England this time, but also made a lot of money. Moreover, when he left, Marin extorted a lot of money from Edward under the pretext of helping Edward to operate in the Vatican, with a total value of hundreds of thousands of gold coins. Therefore, he did not take the dowry of more than 50,000 gold coins seriously. Of course, Marin did not put together so many dowries just to support Anne. Strengthening the alliance with Poland is what Marin cares most about. Sending more dowries can also enhance the favorability of Poland, which is conducive to promoting relations between the two sides. In the future, Marin can use Poland and Lithuania. After all, these are two major powers in Europe. These two countries can not only give Marin strong political assistance, but also help Marin suppress Russia with great potential. After all, the potential of Mauzy has been proved by later generations. Once the hat unifies Eastern Europe, the pressure on Germany will be too great. The situation in Poland and Lithuania is very special. The nobles in these two countries are strong and it is difficult to form an efficient centralized kingdom. Cooperating with them, there is no need to worry about the allies being too powerful, and at the same time, they can use them to suppress potential opponents. Maybe some people find it hard to understand. Shouldn't Poland, a country that looks very democratic, be strong? Yes, Poland is very democratic now, but that is the democratic of the aristocracy, which has nothing to do with the common people or the bourgeoisie. Therefore, in such a country, the local strength is too strong, and it is difficult to form an efficient centralized power, so it is naturally not strong. At least, it cannot be strong militarily. You must know that the strength of the Russian Mauzy is based on the absolute dictatorship of the Tsar. The later strength of Germany was also based on the centralization of the empire. Whether it is Wei Air or the Little Mustache, they can make the whole of Germany run efficiently. This is something that France and Britain do not have. Therefore, the French cannot face Germany alone. Britain and France can only barely fight together. If it were not for Russia's help, Britain and France could not withstand the Second Empire together. In World War II, it was even more unlucky. France, which was always arrogant, was directly destroyed. Therefore, the more centralized a country is, the stronger its war mobilization ability is. Of course, this is a conclusion when the national strength of both sides is similar. If it is the United States and Iraq, then there is nothing to compare. Although the US Congress quarrels every day, any of their leg hairs are thicker than Shotham. So, there is no point in comparing them. It is most appropriate to compare Germany and France during World War I and World War II. Because the national strength of Germany and France was not much different during the two world wars. But Germany mobilized the whole nation and was united. And France was procrastinating all day long. If it were not for the help of Britain, it would not have been able to defeat Germany in World War I. World War II was even more tragic, and the country was directly destroyed. Some people may say that the German army is stronger than the French army. This is true, but the French army is not a coward. During World War I, many French soldiers died in the process of bravely charging, not in concentration camps. To put it bluntly, France just cannot fully transform its strong national strength into war capabilities, which is a common problem of democratic countries. Because the parliamentarians refused. Therefore, Marin concluded that Poland and Lithuania, which were full of mountains and hills, were not a threat. These two countries later perished, while the dictatorial Russian Mauzy was a greater threat. At this stage, the fragmented Germany is far less powerful than the unified and centralized France. Fortunately, the princes of Germany are born to fight in groups. Whoever comes to mess with them, they will fight in groups. Therefore, France cannot annex Germany. Otherwise, Germany will definitely be unlucky. However, the princes of Germany usually like to fight inwardly, and they will only unite when it comes to life and death. For example, when Turkey invaded in a big way. Therefore, Marin likes countries like Poland and Lithuania that are destined to fail. These two countries are destined to be unable to fully transform their strong national strength into war power, and the threat is limited. However, they have the strength to beat Mauzy and resist Turkey. If used well, it is definitely a weapon to stir up the European situation and Marin's best ally. Since we want to win over this best ally, naturally some efforts are still needed. Moreover, the effort this time is not much. The actual cost is only more than 50,000 gold coins, but on the surface it is worth more than 200,000, which will definitely catch the eyes of those Polish nobles. And those Polish nobles are the real masters of Poland. If you have a good relationship with them, you will not suffer in the future. At least, if something happens in the future, Marin will not be alone in fighting against the heroes. Poland may not send troops to help Marin fight, but as long as this ally stands on the side, it will be a huge deterrent. At least, before others form a group to beat themselves up, they should first think about the threat of Poland, and preparing a seemingly very generous dowry is the first step for Marin to win over Poland.